A reading from the Gospel of Thomas. Mary said to Jesus, "What are your disciples like?" He said, "They are like little children living in a field that is not theirs. When the owners of the field come, they will say, 'Give us back our field.' Then the children take off their clothes in front of them in order to give them back, and they return their field to them. For this reason I say, if the owners of a house knew that a thief is coming, they would be on guard before the thief arrives, and will not let the thief break into their house and steal their possessions. As for you then, be on guard against the world. Prepare yourself with great strength so the robbers can't find a way to get to you. For the trouble you expect will come. Let there be a person among you who understands." When the crop ripened, he came quickly carrying a sickle and harvested it. Anyone here with 2 good ears had better listen. Jesus saw some babies nursing. He said to his disciples, "These nursing babies are like those who enter the Father's kingdom." They said to him, "Then shall we enter the Father's kingdom as babies?" Jesus said to them, "When you make the 2 into one, and when you make the inner like the outer, and the outer like the inner, and the upper like the lower, and when you make the male and female into a single one, so that the male will not be male, nor the female be female, when you make eyes in place of an eye, a hand in place of a hand, a foot in place of a foot, an image in place of an image, then you will enter the Father's kingdom." Jesus says, "I shall choose you 1 from 1,000 and 2 from 10,000, and you will stand as a single one." The Gospel of the Lord. Easily the best birthday gift I ever got in my life was a GPS system. Good. About 6 years ago, I got a gift of a GPS system that I can plug into the light of my car, and it has saved my life. I have an extraordinary penchant for getting lost. I spend most of my life trying to find myself. No comment, Ed. I remember one time I was invited to do a wedding in Napa. Now I live up in Sonoma, which isn't that far away. And I'd been preparing the couple. I'd met with them 7 or 8 times, and they told me where the venue was. And I plugged in the venue into Google. I did a Google search, and it gave me a route. And it told me 73 minutes to get from my house to the site of the wedding. So to be sure, I gave myself 3 hours. And I got lost so badly and so often that finally I arrived literally 5 minutes before the ceremony was to start. The bride was in tears. It's bad enough being stood up by your bridegroom, but being stood up by the priest. And the best man was a Marine, and he was there in full regalia with a sword on his side. And for one flashing moment, I thought he was going to behead me. So the GPS system has been so important for me. I get lost again and again and again. So when I was living in Kenya, it wasn't a problem in Kenya because we didn't have roads. So you just took the most direct path. I had an old motorbike, a 185 Suzuki trail bike, and I knew that, if I was send mass on the mountain, I just went for the mountain. And if there were rivers in the way, I went across the rivers. So that was simple. But every 3 years I'd come back to Ireland on vacation. And my brother Seamus, who was a mechanic and who was very, very good to me, he'd always give me a car. He'd give me a car and a credit card for the duration. So he gives me a card this time, and I'm going to a place in Limerick. I don't know Limerick. I barely know Cork after growing up there. I barely know it. I'm going to a strange city called Limerick, and I'm looking for a street called Washington Street. So I get lost 15, 16, 17 times. And finally in frustration, I stop my car, and there's a guy coming against me, and I wind down my window, and I look out, and I said, "Excuse me, could you tell me how to get to Washington Street? And he looked down into the car, peering at this long-haired hippie and wondering just, how bright this guy could be. And he kind of scratches his chin. He said, well, to tell you the truth, no, he says, if I was going to Washington Street, I wouldn't start from here at all. And that's what I want to talk about today. I want to talk about living life in the here and now and getting there from here. And I'm going to make 5 main points this morning. The first one I will say, there is a time for everything. Secondly, the most important thing that doesn't exist. Thirdly, what not to do. Fourthly, what to do. And then fifthly, lucid living. So let me start with, there's a time for everything. This passage that Kaji read for us this morning from Ecclesiastes, it's probably one of the best known passages in all of the Hebrew scriptures in the Old Testament. Most people have heard of it at some stage. And in particular, it's a very popular reading at funerals. Very many funerals will include that in their readings for the funeral mass. Very, very popular. But if you're listening very closely today, it's an upsetting kind of a reading. Because if you pull out a few different pieces, it seems to be suggesting that there is a time for war. And there's a time for killing. And there's a time for hating. It's almost as if the writer is saying, well, it's like, there's a basketball season, and you're supposed to play basketball during the basketball season. You're not supposed to be playing football during the basketball season. And then there comes a football season, and you're supposed to play football at that stage of the year. And then there's a baseball season, and you're supposed to play baseball during the baseball season. It's almost as if it would be mandated. There's a time for each of these things, and there's a time to kill, and there's a time to hate, and there's a time for war. Now, of course, that isn't the intent of the sacred writer, in my opinion. What it means is this. He's not mandating, you got to go kill people at some stage, that's what you got to do. And you got to go make war at some stage, that's what you got to do. And you got to go hate people at some stage, that's what you got to do. He's not saying this in the sense of advocating or mandating it or telling us to do these things. He's saying, you know what, guys? Every human experience is going to involve an experience of these things. There will be a time in your life when you will be in a war situation. There'll be a time in your life when you'll witness killing happening. There'll be a time in your life when you'll be the object or the subject of hatred. And the question is, what are you going to do? So it's not that the sacred writer is advocating any of these things. It's saying these experiences are going to be part of your earth safari. You're going to come up against them. All these things. What are you going to do? How are you going to respond? And so it's not a justification for any of these things. It's the realization they're going to happen. It will be part of our experience. Whether directly or by report, we're going to have the effect of war or the effect of the loss of life through murder or through hatred. We're all going to experience these things. And how will we respond to them? That's the question that the writer of Ecclesiastes is posing to us. Not an advocacy that we engage in these activities, but the realization they will happen. They will be our experiences. What then? How will we disport ourselves? And so when he talks about time then, that's what I'm going to pick up for my second point. I'm going to talk about the most important thing that doesn't exist. St. Augustine was a very bright character, and a genius in many ways. And Augustine thrived around the 300s, around 320. A very, very bright guy. And among a whole bunch of other topics that he put his extraordinary intellect to, he thought about the notion of time, and particularly the notion of measurement of time. And he wrote the following kinds of conclusions. He said, obviously when we speak about the duration of a time or an event, when we say it was of a long duration or a short duration, what does that mean? That an event went on for a long time or a short time? He says, obviously, it really doesn't make sense. Because there is no such thing as the past. The past has ceased to exist. There is no such thing as the future. It has yet to come. It doesn't exist. But even to measure the present, he said, is kind of meaningless. We cannot measure the present. The present does not have duration. The present moment has no duration. So what are we doing instead? He said, what we're doing is we're measuring the memory, the duration of the memory of an event. Not the event, we're measuring the duration of the memory of an event. So the present moment really, insofar as we can put a time tag on it, is not a measurement of the present moment because it has no duration. We're measuring the memory of an event. And it's the memory we're measuring for time. Now, William James, probably the most famous American psychologist of all time who flourished at the beginning of the 1900s, he picked up on Augustine's idea. And he talked about, he called it the difference between the objective present moment and the specious present moment. And he said he agreed with Augustine that what we're actually measuring is our memories of an event. How long the memory appeared. Did it appear a long period of time, or did it appear to be in the flash of an eye? So we're only measuring really the memory of the event, nothing else. And of course science will back that up. Part of the problem with time is that we're measuring different phenomena very, very differently. Light travels at 186,000 miles per second. Sound only travels at 1,100 feet per second. There's a huge discrepancy between the speed of light and the speed of sound. And so if we have a sensorium where an event happens and we're looking at it and we're listening to it, we're getting very different information at different times. So obviously the present moment we can't measure it. So I'll give you a few examples. If you're watching a kid and has a ball and he's throwing the ball against the wall and catching it and throwing the ball and catching it and throwing the ball and catching it, it appears that the sound happens at the instant it hits the wall because the distance is so short. So it's so short that the brain can't compute the difference between them. But I'll give you another instance. You're 200 yards away from somebody working on a roof. There's a guy hammering on a roof, and you're all aware of what happens. You know, you're not hearing the sound at the moment the hammer makes contact with the roof. So you think that what's happening is it goes boom, boom, boom. That's not actually what you're seeing or hearing. What you're seeing and hearing is this: boom, boom, boom. It's as he pulls the hammer away that you hear the sound. It's almost as if the hammer and the roof were made out of some kind of sticky material. What's the word I'm looking for? Velcro. And it's when you're pulling the hammer away from the roof that it makes the sound. That's what it looks like when you're at a distance. And the reason is that sound is traveling at 1,100 feet per second, whereas the light itself is traveling at 186,000 miles per second. So you see it almost immediately, but it's going to take the sound time to travel. So you're not going to hear the sound when it hits the roof. You're going to hear it when the hammer is rising away from the roof. So it's very, very difficult to be in the present moment. There's a split happening there between the present moment as recorded by your eyes and the present moment as recorded by your ears. There's a breakdown right there. To emphasize it further, nobody has ever seen a sunrise. You have never in your life seen a sunrise. When you're watching this golden orb come up over the eastern horizon, it's happened 8 minutes before you first see it, because the sun is 93 million miles away from us and light travels at 186,000 miles per second. So it's going to take 8 minutes for the light to reach your eyes. And so the sun has been doing what it's been doing 8 minutes before you catch the first glimpse of it. It even gets worse. When you start peering out into deep, 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 deep space and you watch a star, you have no idea if that star still exists. Depending on how far away it is, that star may well have exploded 10,000 years ago. You're seeing now what it looked like 10,000 years ago, depending on how far away it is. If it's far enough away, you're seeing it as it was 1 billion years ago. So it is very difficult to talk about the present moment. The present moment has absolutely no duration. So time itself is made up. If you take a novel and you're really, really excited about this novel, you heard this is a great novel, and you take the novel home and you curl up at the side of the fire, you've got a cup of tea and you're really ready to enjoy this, you're going to take the next maybe 15 hours to read through the novel. But before you crack open the covers, the entire plot, all of the characters, the entire line, it's all there already. But you're going to have to impose time on it, some kind of a sequence in order to process what's already there. So it's a huge illusion to think that time exists. So here's the mystery for us. Time does not exist. And this non-existent thing we constantly waste by attempting to live in previous versions of it through fear and anger, and through future versions of it through anxiety. But it doesn't exist. The present moment is not a point in time, it's a point outside of time. So when we're living in the now, we're not living in the present moment of time, we're living in total timelessness. And that's what eternity means. Eternity does not mean a long, 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 long time. Eternity means no time. It means timelessness. And when we get that, that's the object of meditation. That's what the mystics get. that time is the imposition of categories and sequences on the eternal now. And when we can step into the eternal now, we have a totally different experience of life on planet Earth. Then we truly can step into mystical states and into enlightenment. That's my second point. Third point is this. What not to do. So we find ourselves in a life circumstance. An event has just happened. What not to do, but probably mostly actually do. The first thing is, if it's not nice, we refuse to accept it. We refuse to accept where we are. This guy couldn't accept that where I was now was where I was. He preferred to have met me someplace else so he could have directed me to Washington Street. So we can't accept the present circumstances. And so we're stuck. Since we can't accept what is, it's very difficult to get to where we want to be. That's the first mistake we make, in my opinion. The second mistake we make is that we immediately pigeonhole the experience or the event. We want to impose categories on it. And categories are meaningless, in a sense. And Shakespeare, one of the three greatest psychologists I've ever read, said very famously at one stage, there is nothing either good nor bad, but thinking makes it so. So the thing in itself is neither good nor bad. It is our thinking about it. It is the imposition of meaning on it that makes it good or makes it bad. So the second thing we do is we force our experiences into categories. We call them good events, or bad events, or lucky circumstances, or unlucky circumstances. The second mistake we make. The third one is we force memory to do a disservice to us. So faced with a circumstance that we don't accept and that we pigeonhole as a bad thing, we now dig into our memory banks and we pick up and we create filters and fogs over the actual present experience. We're not seeing it as it is. We're seeing it through a fog and a filter of all of the kind of the similar experiences that we've had in the quote-unquote past. That's the third mistake. Then the fourth mistake is we take in our imagination and we use our imagination to scare the daylights out of ourselves about the future. And so there we are, face to face with any live event. We won't accept it and work with it. We categorize it immediately. We bring in our memory so that we actually don't see what's actually in front of us. And then we use our imagination to frighten the daylights out of ourselves through anxiety. That's my third point. So what is a better way of doing it? How to do it? What is a better response to life and to experience? I think it would look like the following. The first is the realization, it's the cosmological perspective that says to me, I am an eternal being. I was never born and I can never die. This is an experience. I have contracted to come into time. I have contracted to have an incarnational experience. This is such an experience. I'm going to work with it. I will firstly absolutely accept it. It doesn't mean I like it. It doesn't mean I agree with it. It doesn't even mean that this is the final outcome and I'm kind of giving up. It's that is the now. That is the reality right now. I fully accept it. And I will get to Washington Street from here. I will use that present, which I have totally accepted, to get to some kind of a destination. I'll move from here. And as I do that, I will use memory in a very different way. I'm not using memory as a fog or a filter to impose on the experience, so I don't see the experience for what it is. I see the experience fully for what it is, with Zen mind or with the child's mind, which is why Jesus insists, when he saw the nursing infants, he said, that's how to get into the kingdom of heaven. To be totally present to every experience, to see it with absolute freshness, not to impose a whole bunch of old memories in it. So what is the function of memory? Function of memory, when well used, is to dig into my repertoire of responses and say, in a similar kind of situation in the past, I tried this and it didn't work, and I tried this other thing and it did work. So my memory can be an ally to me. It can help me dig into the repertoire of my past responses and figure out which ones worked and which ones didn't work. So memory can be an ally. Then I move into imagination. And imagination is the creative part of me. I can look at the possibilities inherent in the situation. And so in the Native American Indian tradition, they divide everything into fours. Four is their sacred number. And they divide the globe and the North American continent into four directions. And the West is the place, they say, it is the place of confusion. And by that, they don't mean that people are just frustrated. They mean it is the field of all possibility. So what we term confusion in our thinking, for the Native American shaman, it was a field of all possibility. It's only limited by your imagination. So when you bring in imagination as a creative faculty, there are lots of possible ways forward. The next step is the realization that I can't become attached to any particular response. If I make a response to a situation and the outcome is not a good outcome, is not one that I want, then I use a different response. So I'm not attached to doing it the same way again and again and again that I did in the past. If it's not working, do it differently. That's the next piece. And then the final piece of the puzzle for me is the realization that every experience and every event is an opportunity for growth. And I've told you this story before, how when in the last year of my training in the seminary, because we were being trained to work in Africa, we did a year-long training in what was called community development. It was a very analytical model, where they trained you how to go into a third world country, to live in very remote areas, to immediately identify who the leaders were, what the resources were, what the needs of the people were, what the problems were, how to set up long-term goals, how to set up short-term objectives, to realize what will the obstacles be to the realizations of these goals, figure out ways to deal with those. It was a very analytical system, and they drilled it into us. And so I got to Africa at age 26, and I'm in my first mission, literally on the equator, temperatures of 122 degrees, and I'm sitting at a meeting of the elders one day, and I'm doing my shtick. You guys are the leaders, here are the resources here are the problems I see, here are the felt needs of the tribe, here's a possible long-term goal, here's an objective, here's what's probably going to happen, here's how we deal with it, and I'm doing my shtick. And this old man is sitting there with this bemused look on his face. And right in the middle of my diatribe, he says, "Can I ask you a question?" "I'm 26, I'm Irish, I know everything." "Sure." He says to me, "Why is it that for you Europeans, your only response to a problem is to want to solve it?" And it sounded to me like a Zen koan. I mean, what the hell do you do with a problem except solve it? Get a real guy. So I'm totally stuck. The first time in my life, I'm stuck for words. And so if I mumble a few times and I say, "Well," "What do you do when you have a problem?" And I'll never forget his response. We were talking in Swahili, but in translation, he more or less said to me, "A problem is an invitation to self-transcendence. And if all you do is solve it, life will just give you another problem." And I've never forgotten it. That the whole idea of an event or an experience is an opportunity for self-transcendence. And when we contract to come in here and to have an incarnational experience on planet Earth, we are contracting to meet situations that afford us the possibility of remembering who we really are and transcending mere ego. And that's what this old man was teaching me. And that's the last piece of what to do, is the realization that whatever circumstance I'm in right now, the invitation of this circumstance is not just to solve it. That will come as a kind of a codicil. The invitation of it is to transcend and to go to a higher level of self. That's my fourth point. My fifth point is this then. Lucid living. You all have the experience every night of dreaming many, many times. Some of you won't remember your dreams, but every one of us will dream in an 8-hour sleep six or seven times in the course of the night. Now, what we begin to realize is when you're having the dream, it appears to be happening to you. When you wake up, you realize that you crafted the dream yourself. You created the plot, the characters, the locations, the costumes, the dialogue, the script, and you're all of the characters in the dream. But for purposes of enjoying the dream, you have amnesia for the fact that you're all the characters in the dream, and you play the role of the dream ego, and you're surprised at what the other players are doing or saying. Then you wake up and you realize, wow, you know what? I had this great dream last night. You did as Steven Spielberg. You created a location and a plot and a script and characters and costumes, and you inhabited all of it. Now, occasionally people have the experience of dreaming lucidly. And lucid dreaming is the experience whereby in the middle of the dream, you realize that this is a dream. You said that this is a dream, or this is only a dream. Now, when you realize that, you have three choices. If in the middle of a dream you realize you're dreaming, you have three choices. The first choice is that you can wake yourself up. If you don't like the dream, you can say, because it's only a dream, I'm going to wake myself up. I don't like this. The second choice you have is, since it's only a dream, then nothing can happen to you. If you fall over the cliff, you're not actually going to die physically. Your physical body is not going to die if you fall over the cliff in the dream. So let's see what it's like to fall over a cliff in a dream. So you can just go with the flow and go where it takes you. Or thirdly, since you realize it's a dream, and you've crafted the dream anyway, why not now begin to take active direction of the dream? Push the dream into an area that you want to investigate. Have a ball with it. See what it's like to fly. So you're falling out of a 3rd story or a 30th story window, direct the dream and say, I'm going to fly in this dream, and see what it's like to fly in this dream. So you have 3 choices. Wake yourself up, just go with the flow, or now direct the flow. But we have exactly the same choice as we live life, because this too is a dream. In fact, it may well be the deepest dream of all, since we live in a nested series of dreams. I'm convinced that what we call life, or waking life, is merely a dream being dreamt by the ego. And the ego is simply a dream that the soul is having. And the soul is simply a dream that the spirit is having. And spirit is simply a dream that source is having. So we live in a nested series of dreams. And this one that we grandiosely think to be waking consciousness is the deepest dream of the lot. And when we get that, and this is what all the mystics tell us, so it's not only a dream in the sense that it doesn't exist, dreams are real. This is a real dream we're having. It is real, and it is a dream. It's not made up, it's not an illusion, it is real. It's a real dream. It's the deepest dream of all. And when we get that this is a dream, we have the same 3 choices we have with the night dreams. Now that I know it's only a dream, I can wake myself up. I can now determine I will merge with Source. I will let go of everything in between, all of the gross body, the etheric body, the astral body, the mental body, the causal body, Atman, and I will merge totally with Brahma consciousness. That's one choice. And some mystics make that choice. Secondly, since it's a dream, a deep, deep, deep dream, since nothing can happen to me, since I'm an eternal being, and even if I were to be killed and to lose my physical body, since I am not my physical body, nothing bad can happen to me. So I will participate fully in the dream of life and let it take me where it will. Or since I know that it's a dream that's been created by me, but not me as Sean, me the source, then I can take control of it and I can respond to it very, very consciously, making loving responses to life instead of making fear-filled, anxious or angry responses to life. This life that we're living right now was the roller coaster ride that you were really, really anxious for, that you signed up for, that you came down for. Not only that, you persuaded a whole bunch of your friends to come along for it. It'll be great fun. Come on, it'll be great fun. You queued up at the launching pad for the start of it, and you paid your money. Having done all that, don't you owe it to yourself and to your friends to really enjoy the ride?